The sun had already set behind the tall studio buildings, and only the soft glow of street lights touched the quiet lot. The film crew had finished for the day. Laughter and voices faded as everyone left one by one. Yet Keanu still stood alone on the empty set. His face, so calm and gentle before everyone, had changed into something silent and heavy. His smile had disappeared like light behind a closing curtain. For months, people on set had whispered about how kind he was, how patient, how respectful. But no one saw what Sandra saw that evening. She stood at a distance, watching him pack his things slowly, like someone moving through memories instead of objects. He did not rush. He did not speak. He just folded his coat, placed it over his arm, and walked out through the narrow back gate where no one else ever went. Sandra followed quietly without knowing why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was concern. Maybe it was because she had always felt that Keanu's calm was not emptiness. It was control. And control often hides pain. She stopped when she saw him under a dim yellow streetlight across the parking area. He was sitting on the ground beside his motorbike, staring at a small old photograph in his hand. The light reflected softly on his eyes. He was not crying, but there was a stillness so deep it almost looked like grief. She wanted to walk closer, to ask if he was all right, but something told her not to break the silence. She watched him trace his finger over the edge of the photo as if it carried more meaning than words could ever tell. The night was cold. The sound of distant traffic mixed with the faint rustle of leaves. Then Keanu folded the photograph carefully and placed it inside his jacket pocket. He stood, put on his helmet, and drove away into the darkness without looking back. Sandra stood there long after he left. She could not explain what she felt. It was not pity. It was something deeper, a quiet ache for someone who had given the world so much kindness, yet seemed to carry none for himself. The next morning she arrived early on set. Keanu was already there, helping a young lighting assistant fix a cable. He smiled as if nothing had happened the night before. When he greeted her, his voice was warm and calm. No trace of sadness. No trace of the man she saw under that streetlight. That contrast stayed in her mind all day. During the shoot, she kept glancing at him, studying every detail. His steady hands, his soft tone when he spoke to others. The way he always said thank you, even to the smallest crew member. But once, when the camera stopped rolling and the studio went quiet, she saw his eyes again. That brief second when no one was looking, they seemed distant, like he was somewhere else entirely. Later that week, during a short break, Sandra found herself sitting beside him near the piano placed for one of the film's scenes. He was tuning the instrument, pressing each key softly. She watched his focus. Finally, she asked gently, "Do you always work this late?" He smiled faintly and said, "It keeps my mind busy." She nodded. Then she said, "And when your mind is quiet?" Keanu paused. His fingers rested on the keys. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then he pressed one note soft and low and said, "Quiet is not always peace." The words hung between them like an echo. She wanted to ask more, but he stood and excused himself politely. The next day, Sandra couldn't stop thinking about that line. Quiet is not always peace. What did he mean by that? That night, as she walked to her car after rehearsal, she noticed something glowing faintly near the studio fence. It was a small candle placed beside a picture frame with flowers around it. She moved closer. The photo was old and slightly faded. Keanu was in it, standing beside another young man who looked strikingly similar to him, but with brighter eyes. Beneath the frame were the words, "In memory of my brother." Her heart sank. She realized the photograph she saw in his hand that night might have been the same one. She whispered softly to herself, "So that's what he carries." For the next few days, she watched him differently. His kindness suddenly felt heavier, like each act of generosity came from a place of healing others while quietly ignoring his own wounds. He helped a makeup artist who tripped and dropped her kit. He stopped his car one evening to help a stranger push a broken-down vehicle. He listened when people talked, even when their stories were long and ordinary. He always smiled, but Sandra now saw the effort behind that smile. Then one afternoon, something unexpected happened. During a break, Keanu was sitting in the corner reading a small, worn-out notebook. When he left to take a call, he forgot it on the table. Sandra hesitated for a moment, then gently opened it to place a note inside telling him he'd forgotten it. But when she opened the first page, she froze. It wasn't a script or notes. It was filled with short letters, all written to someone named Sam. One line caught her attention. "I still talk to you even though you never answer. Maybe silence is how you forgive me." She closed the notebook immediately. Her hands trembled slightly. She placed it back and stepped away just as Keanu returned. He smiled softly and said, "Thanks for watching my bag." She nodded quickly, pretending she hadn't seen a thing. That night, her mind was restless. She lay awake thinking about the letter, the photo, and his quiet voice saying, "Quiet is not always peace." She felt an urge she couldn't explain, to do something, to find a way to reach him. Not with sympathy, but with something real. Because she knew what it felt like to hide pain behind a smile. She had done it once, too, years ago. The next morning, she arrived early again. She saw Keanu sitting alone near the same piano, his eyes closed as he played a slow tune. The music was soft but full of ache. Sandra stood quietly and listened. When he noticed her, he stopped playing. She smiled gently and said, "That sounded like a story." He looked at her and replied, "Maybe it was." For a moment, they just looked at each other, both aware that something unspoken was slowly being understood between them. Sandra didn't ask about his pain. She didn't need to. She just said, "You once helped me when I was lost. Maybe it's my turn to help you now." He smiled faintly, that same calm but distant smile, and said, "I don't need help." But Sandra saw the truth in his eyes, and she whispered softly, "Maybe not help, maybe peace." As she walked away, Keanu watched her go. For the first time in a long while, he felt something shift inside him, a sense that maybe someone had finally seen through the quiet walls he had built. The next days would change everything for both of them, because Sandra was not going to walk away this time. She had made a silent promise to find a way to heal the pain that kindness alone could not hide. The next morning came with a soft drizzle that made the streets glisten under the pale sunlight. Sandra arrived early again, her heart strangely restless. She could not stop thinking about Keanu's face the night before, the quiet way he looked at her when she said the word peace. Something in his eyes told her that he wanted to believe her, but years of silence had taught him not to. When she entered the studio, she found Keanu already there as always. He was standing beside a young cleaner, helping her carry a heavy bucket of water. The girl kept thanking him, but he only smiled and said, "Kindness costs nothing." His voice was gentle, steady, but Sandra noticed the distance again. It was like he existed in two worlds, the one he showed to others and the one he never let anyone touch. During the break, Sandra decided to speak to one of the older crew members who had worked with Keanu for years. She asked softly, "Has he always been this quiet?" The man sighed and said, "Ever since his brother passed, yes. It was long ago, but I think a part of him never came back." Sandra felt a chill travel through her body. She wanted to ask more, but the man added, "He doesn't talk about it. He just keeps giving, maybe to fill the space where words should be." The thought stayed with her all day. She began to notice small details. How Keanu avoided talking about family, how he smiled whenever someone shared their pain, as if saying he understood. She wondered what had really happened to his brother, what part of that story he carried like a hidden wound. That evening, she found herself sitting alone in the quiet corner of the cafeteria, watching him talk to a young actor who seemed nervous about his role. Keanu listened patiently, nodding, offering advice in his calm tone. When the young man left, Keanu sat in silence for a few minutes, staring at his tea without drinking it. Sandra hesitated, then walked over and sat down beside him. She said softly, "You always listen to everyone. Does anyone listen to you?" He smiled faintly and replied, "I talk less because silence doesn't argue." She looked at him closely and said, "But silence also doesn't heal." He did not reply. Instead, he looked out the window where the rain had started again. The glass reflected his face like a faint shadow. For a few seconds, the sound of rain filled the air between them. Then he spoke quietly. "He used to say the same thing." Sandra frowned slightly. "Who?" Keanu turned to her, eyes softer than she had ever seen. "My brother, Sam." For the first time, she heard him say the name out loud. It felt sacred, like a memory pulled from deep within. She didn't ask anything more, but that small opening was enough. Later that night, as she drove home, she whispered the name to herself. Sam. It felt like the key to something bigger than she yet understood. The next day, Sandra went online and began searching quietly. She wanted to learn more, not out of curiosity, but out of care. She found an old article from years ago. It mentioned a tragic accident involving a young musician named Sam Reeves. The article said he was talented, gentle, and deeply close to his older brother, Keanu. It also mentioned that the two were working on a charity project for struggling artists before Sam's death. Sandra sat still for a long time, staring at the screen. So that was it. That was where his pain came from. Not just loss, but unfinished love, a dream left incomplete. She closed the laptop and leaned back. Her heart ached for him. The following day, Sandra arrived with a quiet determination. She began asking small questions around the set, trying to understand more about his charity work. She learned he still donated anonymously to local art centers and youth shelters. He often visited a small music home once a week. Most people didn't even know. So one evening, she followed him, carefully, respectfully, from a distance. He stopped at a modest building in the quieter part of the city. The board said Hope Strings Foundation. Through the window, she saw children with small violins and guitars laughing as he tuned their instruments and clapped softly to their songs. He smiled at them genuinely, and for the first time, she saw light in his eyes instead of pain. She stayed outside for a long time, watching. Something inside her began to shift. She realized his kindness was not an escape. It was his bridge to the world, a way of keeping his brother's memory alive. But even bridges wear down when they are never repaired. The next morning, she found him sitting by the piano again. She brought 2 cups of tea and placed one near him. "I know about the music home," she said softly. His hands paused on the keys. "How?" he asked, surprised. "I went there," she admitted. "I saw you with the kids. They adore you." He looked down and said, "It's the only place that feels quiet in a good way." Sandra nodded slowly and said, "Your brother would be proud." He froze. For a moment, his mask slipped completely. Pain flickered through his eyes, followed by a deep, trembling breath. "I don't know," he whispered. "I failed him once." Sandra leaned closer and said gently, "Sometimes love isn't about what we couldn't do. It's about what we still do in their name." Keanu closed his eyes. He didn't speak, but she saw a single tear form and fall silently onto the piano keys. He wiped it quickly and smiled again as if nothing happened. But Sandra knew. Something inside him had cracked open. Later that evening, while leaving the set, she found a folded letter tucked under her car's wiper. It had no name, only a single line written in familiar handwriting. "Thank you for seeing what others don't." She held the letter close, feeling warmth rise in her chest. For the first time, she felt that Keanu trusted her, just a little, but she also sensed something else. Something deeper was hidden still. The letter felt like a door slightly open, behind which a secret waited quietly in the dark. She knew she had to find it, not to uncover his pain, but to free him from it. The story of his brother was only part of the truth. Something else was tied to that guilt he carried. She could feel it. The next chapter of their bond was about to begin. And neither of them knew that what Sandra would discover soon would not only change how she saw Keanu, but also how he saw himself. The night air was quiet and cool when Sandra sat alone in her apartment, her thoughts spinning around Keanu like the slow rhythm of a haunting song. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still hidden, something deeper than grief. She had seen kindness born from pain before, but in Keanu, it was almost sacred. Like every act of goodness was a way of saying sorry to someone who could no longer hear it. The next morning, filming resumed at dawn. The studio buzzed with the usual noise, crew members rushing, lights flickering, props moving. Sandra arrived early again, hoping to see him before the others did. But Keanu was already there, sitting beside the piano, reading the same old notebook she had noticed days ago. She stood silently near the doorway, watching him turn each page slowly as if reading words carved into his soul. After a while, he closed the notebook, placed it inside his bag, and walked out to make a call. Sandra hesitated for a long moment before stepping closer. She wasn't planning to pry, but her heart guided her hands. She opened the notebook gently, just enough to see the first few lines of a folded letter tucked inside. The handwriting was delicate, the ink slightly faded. Her eyes caught one sentence that made her breath stop. "Sam, I still don't forgive myself for the night you called and I didn't answer." She froze. The words were heavy, trembling on the page. It wasn't just sadness, it was guilt. Deep, aching guilt that had never been spoken aloud. She closed the notebook quickly, her heart pounding. It felt wrong to read more, yet she couldn't walk away from what she had already seen. Now she understood the weight behind his silence. He wasn't only mourning his brother's loss. He was living with the belief that he could have stopped it. When Keanu returned, she had already stepped back, pretending to scroll through her phone. He smiled at her and said softly, "You're early again." She smiled faintly and replied, "You make mornings look peaceful." He chuckled softly and said, "Only when I forget what's inside my head." The day went on as usual, but Sandra couldn't focus. Her mind kept returning to that one line. "I still don't forgive myself for the night you called and I didn't answer." She wanted to tell him that forgiveness wasn't something you wait for, it was something you give to yourself. But she knew he wasn't ready to hear that yet. That evening, when the shoot ended, she walked outside and saw Keanu sitting on a wooden bench under the soft glow of the studio's old lamp. The same place she had seen him on that first night. She walked over quietly and sat beside him. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Then she said gently, "When someone we love is gone, silence feels like punishment. But maybe it's not." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes silence is the only thing that answers back," he said softly. She nodded. "And sometimes silence is just waiting for the right words." He didn't respond, but she saw something in his eyes shift, a flicker of trust. 2 days later, the crew prepared for a special rehearsal. Keanu had agreed to play a short piano piece as part of a behind-the-scenes tribute for their upcoming charity segment. As the music played, Sandra stood nearby, her eyes on him the whole time. The melody was soft, sad, and hauntingly beautiful. When it ended, there was a moment of silence before the crew began clapping, but Keanu's eyes were wet. He quickly turned away and left the stage without a word. Sandra followed him out of the hall. She found him standing near the side door, wiping his eyes quietly. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there. Finally, she asked, "That music, it was his, wasn't it?" He looked at her surprised. Then he nodded slowly. "It was something we wrote together." He called it the Song of Peace. He wanted to finish it before his last concert, but he never got the chance. "So you finished it for him," she said softly. He smiled faintly, but it was a broken kind of smile. "No," he whispered. "I tried, but it never feels complete." For a moment, they just stood there in the quiet. Then Sandra said, "Maybe it will feel complete when you forgive yourself." He looked away. "That's harder than you think." She took a step closer. "I know, but pain isn't meant to be carried forever, Keanu. Sometimes it just wants to be seen." He didn't reply, but the silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was alive, like something fragile beginning to breathe. Later that night, when Sandra returned home, she found a small envelope slipped under her dressing room script. There was no name, but she recognized his handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper. It read, "Thank you for reminding me that silence can heal too. I never said this to anyone, but my brother was my mirror. When he left, I stopped looking." Sandra read the note several times, her eyes stinging. It was the first time he had allowed anyone into his hidden world. Over the next few weeks, their friendship grew quietly. They shared coffee breaks, late-night rehearsals, small jokes, and comfortable silences that didn't need words. Keanu began to open up in small ways, tiny fragments of memories that slipped out when he least expected. She listened, never interrupting, never pushing, but something still haunted him. She could feel it in the way he sometimes went distant, as if replaying an old memory. She knew there was one truth left unsaid. Something about that night when Sam called. Then, one late evening, as rain tapped softly on the studio roof, Keanu finally spoke. They were sitting by the piano again, alone after everyone had gone. He said quietly, "He called me that night. I was filming, tired, distracted. I thought I'd call him back later. I never did. And by morning, he was gone. His voice broke on the last word. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and held his hand gently. You didn't fail him, she whispered. You loved him. He knew that. He shook his head. How can love matter if it's too late? She squeezed his hand tighter. Because love never waits for the right time. It just stays, even when we think it's gone. For a long time, neither spoke. The sound of rain filled the silence. When he finally looked up, his eyes were soft, filled with pain, but also something new. Hope. Sandra knew in that moment that he had begun to forgive himself, even if just a little. But she also knew this was not the end of his healing. There was still one thing left undone, something she could feel but not name. And she silently made a promise to herself that she would find a way to help him see the truth he could not see on his own. Because sometimes the kindest act is not saying the right words, but showing them in a way the heart cannot refuse. The next few days passed quietly, but something within Sandra had changed. She could no longer look at Keanu the same way. Now, every smile he gave seemed layered with meaning. Every silence carried weight. She realized he wasn't just a man living with sorrow, he was a man trying to redeem it, one kind act at a time. And that realization made her heart ache in a way she hadn't felt before. She watched him on set helping a cameraman lift equipment, checking if an extra had eaten and comforting a nervous intern who forgot her lines. His calmness was magnetic, but behind it, she could still sense the echo of guilt that refused to fade. That night, while driving home, she thought about the letter again. The one where he wrote, I still don't forgive myself for the night you called and I didn't answer. She gripped the steering wheel tightly. Forgiveness could not be given to him by anyone else. It had to be earned through truth. But maybe she could help him see that the truth was never as cruel as he believed. The next morning, she began to build a quiet plan. She contacted an old friend who worked in charity events. Sandra asked her to gather any information about the Hope Strings Foundation, the same music home she had seen Keanu visiting. Her friend promised to help. 2 days later, Sandra got a call. Her friend said the foundation had once been co-founded by 2 brothers, Sam and Keanu Reeves. Sandra was stunned. She hadn't known that. Her friend continued, After Sam's death, Keanu kept the charity alive in his name. He never took credit. All the donations were listed under Sam's legacy. Sandra felt her heart twist. He had been honoring his brother all these years, silently, without telling anyone. She asked if there was anyone left from Sam's circle, friends, musicians, people who might have known him. Her friend promised to look deeper. For days, Sandra went on filming as usual, but every evening she returned to the same thought, how to bring him peace without hurting his privacy. She didn't want to open old wounds. She wanted to remind him that his brother's love never vanished, that the world hadn't forgotten Sam, and neither should he. One afternoon, after rehearsal, she approached Keanu as he sat tuning the piano. I was thinking, she said gently, you should share your story with the world. It might help others heal. He looked at her, startled. My story? Yes, she said softly. Your kindness, your silence. It's not just yours. It could teach people what strength really looks like. He smiled sadly. Strength isn't what I have. It's what I pretend to have so others don't break. Sandra shook her head. Maybe, but even pretending kindness changes lives. He didn't reply, but his eyes softened. That night, Sandra received another message from her friend. She had found an address, a small apartment where Sam's old friend, a music teacher named Elena, still lived. Elena had been one of the last people to see Sam alive. The next morning before shooting, Sandra drove to meet her. Elena was an elderly woman with gentle eyes and trembling hands. When Sandra mentioned Keanu's name, Elena smiled faintly. He still sends funds for the children every month, she said. He never forgot. Sandra hesitated, then asked, Did Sam ever talk about Keanu before that night? Elena nodded. He loved his brother. He said Keanu was his anchor. The night before he passed, he wrote something, a short recording. He said if anything ever happened, he wanted Keanu to know that he forgave him for everything. Sandra's breath caught. A recording? Elena nodded again and handed her a small old music player. I never had the courage to send it. Maybe it's time. Sandra took it with trembling hands. She drove back to the studio with tears in her eyes. She sat in her car, pressed play, and listened. A young, warm voice filled the air. Hey, brother, if you're hearing this, I probably left sooner than I should. Don't blame yourself. You gave me everything good in life. You were my peace when the world was loud. Promise me you'll keep playing. Don't stop loving because of me. The message ended with the faint sound of guitar strings. Sandra sat motionless, her eyes filled with tears. She knew instantly what she had to do. This was the truth that could free him. Not words from her, but words from the brother. He thought he had failed. For the next few days, she began quietly preparing something. She contacted the Hope Strings Foundation and asked them to help her organize a small event. She told them it was a private thank you gathering for Keanu, but the true purpose was bigger. On the day of the event, Sandra invited Keanu to the foundation under the pretense of a short meeting for a donation ceremony. He arrived in his usual quiet way, dressed simply, unaware of what was about to happen. When he entered the hall, he froze. The room was filled with people, children, families, elderly musicians, all the lives he had quietly touched. One by one, they turned to him with smiles. Sandra stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. These are the people you helped, the ones you never told anyone about. He looked around, speechless. Some of the children held small notes, others held instruments. They began to play a melody together, soft and trembling. And then Sandra handed him the old music player. Someone else wanted to say something to you, she whispered. He took the player with shaking hands. When the recording began, his face changed. As his brother's voice filled the room, Keanu's eyes widened. Everyone went silent. The only sound was Sam's gentle message of love and forgiveness. By the time the message ended, tears streamed down Keanu's face. He covered his mouth, unable to speak. The room stayed quiet, as if even the air respected the moment. When he finally looked up, his voice was barely a whisper. How did you... Sandra smiled softly. Sometimes love just finds its way back. Keanu looked around the room again, then at her, and for the first time in years, his shoulders loosened, his eyes peaceful. It was as if the heavy armor he wore had finally fallen. That night, after everyone left, Keanu sat alone in the empty hall, the candlelight flickering gently. Sandra walked in and sat beside him. He turned to her and said quietly, I didn't think I could ever hear his voice again. She replied softly, You didn't need to. He was always speaking through you. For a long while, neither said a word. The silence between them was not painful anymore. It was calm. It was real. But what Sandra didn't know yet was that there was still one more surprise left in her plan. Something that would turn this quiet healing into a moment the world would never forget. The sun rose gently over the quiet city that morning. A soft golden light touched the windows of the Hope Strings Foundation, where Sandra's secret plan had been carefully set into motion. Every chair in the small hall had been decorated with simple white flowers. No cameras, no reporters, no audience, only real faces, real hearts. These were the people Keanu had helped over the years without ever asking for anything in return. Sandra stood near the piano, her hands trembling slightly. The children tuned their instruments. The elderly musicians whispered prayers. The young artists arranged their notes and small letters of gratitude. The entire room felt like a heartbeat waiting to be heard. Outside, Keanu's car pulled up. He stepped out slowly, wearing his usual calm expression. He thought it was another quiet charity event. He didn't know Sandra had spent weeks preparing this moment. When he entered the hall, everything stopped. As soon as the door opened, the crowd turned toward him. Dozens of faces, some familiar, many strangers, but all connected to his kindness. The children cheered softly. The adults smiled warmly. In the center of the stage, a large framed picture of Sam Reeves stood surrounded by candles and flowers. Above it, a sign read in gentle letters, "Thank you for keeping his light alive." Keanu froze where he stood. For the first time in many years, he had no words. Sandra walked up to him quietly and said, "This is not just for Sam. This is for you too." His eyes darted across the room, faces he remembered helping one by one. The boy whose violin he had repaired. The old man whose rent he had paid without revealing his name. The young woman who once said his kindness made her believe in people again. Now all of them stood there together, smiling at him through tears. Then Sandra gently guided him toward the piano. "We have something for you," she said softly. A little girl stepped forward, holding a notebook. "You wrote us notes, sir," she said. We wrote back. She opened the notebook filled with hundreds of messages, handwritten in different styles. Each one carried the same message in different words. "You healed us when you were hurting." Keanu's lips parted. His eyes glistened, but he didn't speak. His hands trembled as he turned the pages, reading one note after another. The hall fell completely silent. The children began to play a melody in the background, the same song of peace he had once written with his brother. The music filled the room like a memory reborn. Keanu closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. His shoulders began to shake. Tears rolled down his face, slow and unstoppable. When the music ended, he stood, looking at everyone, trying to find words but finding only emotion. Finally, he whispered, "You shouldn't have done this." Sandra smiled softly. "We had to, because you never let anyone do something for you." He lowered his head, overwhelmed. "I don't deserve this." She took a gentle step closer. "You deserve peace, Keanu. That's all this is." Then she handed him the small music player, the same one Elena had given her. She said quietly, "Someone else wanted to speak to you too." He looked confused at first, then pressed play. The hall fell silent again as Sam's voice filled the air. "Hey, brother," the recording began. "If you're hearing this, it means I couldn't tell you in person. Please don't blame yourself. You gave me everything good in this world. Your kindness was my mirror. Promise me you'll keep living like you always did, quiet, humble, and kind. Don't stop because of me." Keanu covered his mouth as the voice played on. His knees grew weak and he sat down, holding the player close like a fragile piece of his heart had come back home. When the message ended, there was not a sound in the room, only Keanu's quiet sobbing. Sandra knelt beside him and whispered, "He never blamed you. He just wanted you to forgive yourself." Keanu looked at her with tear-filled eyes. "How did you find this?" She smiled faintly. "Love leaves trails. I just followed them." For a long time, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached out and held her hand. It was the first time he had let anyone touch his pain without pulling away. The children started playing the song again, softly, as if the melody itself was giving him permission to breathe again. When it ended, Keanu stood, his face calm and wet with tears. He looked around the room at the people who had come because of him. His voice shook, but it was steady enough to carry. "I spent years trying to make peace with silence," he said. But peace was never in silence. It was in people, in love that never stopped reaching out. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness always finds its way home." The room filled with soft applause, not loud, not rushed, just honest. He turned to Sandra and said quietly, "You did this for me." She shook her head. "No, I did this for the part of you that still needed to hear you were enough." The candles flickered. The hall glowed. In that moment, Keanu smiled. Not the polite smile he gave the world, but a real one, fragile and full of light. It was the kind of smile that only appears when grief finally makes peace with love. After everyone left, Keanu and Sandra sat together in the empty hall. The faint sound of music still echoed in the background. He turned to her and said, "For the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm walking alone." She looked at him and whispered, "You never were. You just stopped looking beside you." They both laughed softly through the tears. It wasn't joy. It was relief, the kind that comes when broken pieces finally find their place again. Neither of them knew it yet, but what Sandra had done that day would ripple far beyond that hall. It would become a moment of quiet healing, not only for Keanu, but for everyone who ever believed that kindness ends when pain begins. The night after the event felt strangely peaceful. The city lights shimmered across the quiet streets as Keanu drove through them slowly, his window down, the cool wind brushing against his face. For the first time in years, the silence inside him didn't hurt. It didn't echo like emptiness. It simply rested. He kept replaying the sound of Sam's voice from the recording. It felt unreal, like his brother had reached across time to touch him one last time. Each word carried forgiveness, and with it, a weight lifted that had been buried for too long. When he reached home, he placed the old music player on his piano. He sat there for a long while, staring at it, then began to play. The same melody Sam had once started. This time, Keanu finished it. The notes flowed gently, no longer heavy, no longer broken. When the final key faded, he whispered softly, "Thank you, Sam." The next morning, Sandra found him already on set, early as always. But something was different. His posture was lighter. His smile reached his eyes. When he greeted her, there was no hidden ache behind his words. It was as if a long, invisible winter had finally ended. She smiled back, pretending not to notice the change, even though she did. Inside, she felt a quiet pride. She hadn't healed him. She had simply reminded him that he could heal himself. After the shoot, Keanu approached her and said, "Walk with me." They left the studio and walked down a path lined with tall trees swaying gently in the wind. For a while, they didn't talk. It was the kind of silence that felt whole instead of heavy. Finally, he stopped, turned to her, and said, "I need to tell you something." She nodded softly. "The night Sam died," he began, his voice low and calm. "I always believed I failed him. I missed his call, and for years I thought that was why he left. But after hearing his voice again, I realized something. It wasn't my silence that hurt him, it was his own loneliness. I couldn't have saved him, but I could honor him. And maybe that's what I've been trying to do all this time." Sandra looked at him with gentle eyes. "You have honored him, Keanu. Not through guilt, but through love. Everything you did was his music carried forward." He smiled faintly. "And you reminded me that peace isn't forgetting, it's forgiving." They continued walking until they reached the same old park where he often rode his bike after late shoots. A few children were playing nearby, laughing freely. Keanu watched them and said quietly, "He loved parks. He said music lived in children's laughter." Sandra's eyes softened. "Then maybe he's here right now." They sat on a bench as the sun began to set, painting the sky in orange and gold. The light reflected off the calmness on his face. After a long pause, he turned to her and said, "You went so far to do all this. Why?" Sandra took a deep breath and said softly, "Because you once told me that quiet is not always peace. And I couldn't let you keep believing that. Someone had to remind you that even the calmest hearts deserve to be understood." He stared at her for a moment, speechless. Then he smiled gently. "You know Sam would have loved you." She laughed softly through her tears. "Maybe he does, from wherever he is." A small breeze passed through the trees, rustling the leaves like a whisper. For a brief moment, Keanu closed his eyes and felt something. Something warm, familiar, peaceful. It was as if Sam's presence brushed against him, not in sorrow, but in gratitude. Later that week, Sandra received a message from Keanu. It was a short note written in his calm, steady handwriting. It read, "You once said peace begins when pain is seen. Thank you for seeing mine. From now on, I'll make sure kindness isn't just a gift. It's also a reminder of love that never leaves." Attached to the message was a photo. It showed a new plaque installed at the Hope Strings Foundation. It read, "The Sam Reeves Music Hall, where pain turns into peace." Sandra stared at the picture, her eyes filling with tears again. She whispered softly, "He finally found his way home." A few months later, during a quiet evening event, Keanu surprised everyone. He stood on stage at the foundation, holding a microphone for the first time in years. The audience was small, mostly children, teachers, and volunteers. Sandra sat in the front row, smiling quietly. He said, "Once upon a time, I believed that silence was strength. But I've learned that strength is also letting someone see your silence. Tonight, this song is not for sadness. It's for healing." Then he began to play, the song of peace. This time, it wasn't sorrowful. It was full of light, rising, flowing, alive. Every note carried both brothers' spirits, joined by love that never died. When it ended, the room was silent for a few seconds before gentle applause began. After the event, Sandra walked up to him. He looked at her and said softly, "You did the unexpected." "You healed me," she smiled. "No, Keanu. Love did." He smiled back, a quiet, humble smile. And for the first time in his life, that smile stayed. As they walked out into the night, the stars above shimmered like soft echoes of everything they had lost and everything they had found again. And though neither spoke another word, both knew one truth. Some pains never fully disappear, but when shared with kindness, they transform into light, and in that light, peace finally lived.